They seemed like ordinary girls, but beneath quiet mornings and hand-me-down coats, their whole world hung by a single thread of hope. There are mornings when the strongest among us are simply those who keep going, hiding old wounds behind steady hands and practiced smiles. But what if strength is just pretending? Until one day, in the silent woods, you break, and the only ones left to see you are a dog with tired eyes and two children who know all about being left behind. This is the story of a winter that tested every quiet heart in Cedar Falls, and how, sometimes, saving one life means saving your own. The first cold of October had arrived early in Cedar Falls, spreading a thin veil of mist across the lake and settling in silvery drops on the fields beyond. Leaves drifted down, one by one, in slow-motion spirals, bright embers of yellow and faded copper, carpeting the winding path that followed the edge of the woods. It was early enough that the world felt suspended, hushed except for the hush of wind moving through the branches, the soft tap of acorns falling to earth, and the crisp crunch of boots against frost-stiffened grass. Frank Holbrook walked alone, his breath pale in the morning air. He wore the uniform of a local patrolman, dark blue jacket zipped high, badge dulled with wear, but there was little of the crisp pride you might expect from someone with 20 years of service. His back was straight, his step steady, but there was a weariness around his eyes, a heaviness in his gait, the posture of a man who had become more familiar with loss than with victory. Beside him moved Harlan, an old German shepherd, his coat a dignified patchwork of black and silver, tail held low but never still. Harlan walked with a faint limp, hardly noticeable unless you watched closely, the souvenir of an accident long past, the reason he never finished formal rescue training. But Frank didn't seem to mind. In fact, he looked at the dog sometimes with a kind of silent gratitude, as if recognizing in him another survivor, someone who carried their wounds without apology. They crossed the little wooden bridge where the lake's inlet narrowed into a stony brook. Frank paused for a moment, letting his hand fall to the thick ruff at Harlan's neck. He didn't speak. He almost never did on these walks. There was something in the air that made words unnecessary, or maybe too heavy to carry. He gazed out across the water, where low fog clung to the shore and mallards drifted quietly in the pale light. Every detail felt sharper, colder. The empty dock, the red canoe overturned for winter, the distant flicker of a porch light still burning at the edge of town. It was a morning made for pretending nothing hurt. Frank's jaw was set, his gaze focused and unsentimental, and yet something about his hands, large, rough, meant for steady work, seemed uncertain when they slipped into his pockets, as if searching for warmth that never lasted. The sharp tang of wood smoke drifted from somewhere down the lane. The world was waking, but Frank moved as if only half awake, performing the rituals of his life by muscle memory, pretending, for everyone's sake, that he was whole. A single gust shook the maple above his head, sending a small cascade of leaves swirling down around them. Harlan looked up, ears twitching, then sat beside Frank, leaning just enough that the officer could feel the gentle weight against his shin. Frank didn't acknowledge it with words, but his hand found the old dog's shoulder, fingers tracing the knotted fur where the limp began. There was a language in the touch, unspoken, fragile, that said more than any confession. I see you. I know you're tired too. The path curved away from the lake, rising gently into a stand of birch and pine, white bark bright against the soft gloom. Frank and Harlan walked in silence. The rhythm of their footsteps joined, a solitary procession. For years now, Frank had been the one to hold things together, at work after every setback, after his wife's death and his daughter's departure for college in another state. He was the steady one, the dependable one, the man who carried on, no matter how hollow it sometimes felt inside. And yet, as he watched the sun break loose behind a bank of clouds, sending brief gold across the treetops, he felt a tremor beneath the armor. Not pain exactly, just a memory of vulnerability he thought he'd forgotten. A truck passed on the distant county road, radio faint through the trees, then silence again. The world felt bigger in these early hours, less forgiving. Frank found himself pausing at the old stone marker that once served as the town boundary. He remembered bringing his daughter here as a child, her laughter echoing in the hollow before the trees thickened. Now, years later, he pressed his palm against the cold, rough surface just for a moment. Harlan waited, patient, the only witness to this small surrender. Frank looked at his reflection in the frosted window of an abandoned bait shack, a face grown thinner, more angular, marked by years that nobody else counted. His shoulders, broad but now slightly rounded, gave him away as someone accustomed to carrying more than his share. He straightened, as if someone were watching. Old habits. Even now, even here, it was easier to pretend strength than to admit to the long ache that lived in his bones. As they doubled back toward the main road, a lone crow called from the highest limb. Harlan's tail thumped once, and Frank's lips tightened in what might have been a smile, or just a defense against the cold. The dog nudged him gently, insistent in his way. Let's keep moving, let's go on. So they did, disappearing beneath the gold-lit arch of maples. Two figures in quiet company, each drawing something from the other that neither could name. The morning stretched before them, uncertain but shared. In Cedar Falls, strength was a quiet thing, often measured in what you didn't say, what you refused to show. Frank played his part, cop, neighbor, anchor to a world that kept tilting. But as he and Harlan turned onto the gravel path behind the churchyard, the weight pressed in. The memory of an empty house, the smell of old flannel, the echo of footsteps that only a dog could fill. Frank kept walking, a little faster now, as if the movement itself might outrun the softness threatening to rise. And yet, if anyone had stopped him there, had asked if he was all right, Frank would have answered, steady, maybe even a little sharp, "Of course, I'm fine. Don't worry about me." The words, rehearsed so long, would have come easy, but Harlan knew better. And so, in the fragile hush of autumn, Frank let his guard down for just a moment, letting his hand rest in the warm fur at his side, both of them breathing in the cold and the quiet, both pretending, if only for now, that pretending was enough. The Jensen house sat a little ways back from the county road, hidden behind a stand of old spruce and the wild tangle of blackberry vines that grew unchecked along the split-rail fence. The porch sagged in the middle, its floorboards faded gray, but someone had lined the steps with painted stones and glass jars filled with last summer's marigolds, now brittle and faded. On mornings like this, the house seemed to huddle against the coming winter, gathering whatever warmth it could from the sun before the frost took over for good. Inside, the kitchen was already awake. A kettle hissed on the stovetop. The scent of cheap black tea drifted through the close air, mixing with the sweet, earthy smell of wood smoke. Ellen Jensen, the girl's grandmother, moved slowly from the pantry to the counter. Her knees ached, and her eyes stung from another night of too little sleep. But she kept her back straight, mouth set, as she poured 2 chipped mugs and sliced a heel of bread. 1 piece for each granddaughter, thin and a little stale, but spread with apple butter from the last canning. She didn't call the girls to breakfast. There was no need. At 10, Grace and Lily had learned to move quietly in the mornings, tiptoeing across cold linoleum, pulling on layers of clothes that once belonged to their cousins or neighbors' children. Today, both wore the same hand-me-down green jackets, the sleeves turned up to fit, the pockets full of secrets. Their hair, soft brown and nearly identical, was plaited in thick, messy braids by each other's hand. Lily, a little taller, always started Grace's braid and never made a fuss if it came undone halfway through the day. Harlan was already waiting by the door, his tail making slow, hopeful circles against the baseboard. He had come to them by accident, or maybe by fate, astray at the shelter, overlooked for months because of his limp, his age, his silence. But the moment Grace first pressed her forehead to his, she declared that he had old, brave eyes. They had taken him home the next day. Now he was as much a part of their mornings as tea and toast, and the familiar hush of a household making do. Grace and Lily moved around the kitchen in a kind of wordless dance, finding scarves, slipping bread into wax paper, peeking out the window at the pale sun, brushing crumbs from the table for Harlan to nose at with polite restraint. Ellen placed a firm hand on Lily's shoulder as she passed. It wasn't much, just a bit of pressure, a silent reminder, be careful and come home early. She didn't say the words aloud. Words, she had learned, were a limited resource, best saved for when they mattered most. As the girls zipped their jackets and checked their boots, Grace slipped a battered spiral notebook into her pocket, the cover decorated with dried ferns and pressed leaves, held together with careful rows of clear tape. The notebook was her map of dreams and worries, filled with small handwriting and bigger hopes, a recipe for happiness she'd copied from a library book, a list of things she wanted to ask her mother the next time she was home, sketches of Harlan sleeping in a patch of sun. They stepped outside, Harlan nosing the screen door open ahead of them. The cold stung their cheeks, but the sky was high and blue, and the lake glimmered through the thinning trees. The girls fell into step together, Grace quiet, thoughtful, always a few steps ahead, Lily softer, more likely to pause and marvel at a leaf's color, to tuck a stone into her pocket for later. They moved as one, even in their differences. Behind them, Ellen watched from the porch, wrapping her cardigan tighter. She would wait until their figures disappeared past the corner of the shed, before pouring herself a second cup and sitting down to rest her feet. They didn't talk much as they walked the path that ran between the house and the edge of the woods. They didn't need to. Instead, Grace let her hand brush against Harlan's back, feeling the warmth and the steady movement of his breath. Lily hummed, barely audible, an old lullaby their mother used to sing on nights when she was home, not working the night shift at the care home across town. Harlan trotted ahead, his limp only noticeable in the way he favored one paw, but his movements purposeful and proud. In the clearing beside the lake, the world opened up. There was a log worn smooth by years of sitting, and here the girls stopped. Grace opened her notebook, scribbling down the date, the weather, a small wish for something gentle to happen today. Lily found a maple leaf, perfect and red, pressing it flat between her palms before tucking it into the pocket of her jacket. This was how they built their world, out of small treasures, private rituals, and the quiet understanding that the best parts of life were often unsaid. Sometimes they whispered secrets to Harlan, secrets about school, about the ache of missing their mother, about the fears that snuck in when the wind rattled the window panes at night. Harlan never answered, but he always listened, ears tilted forward, eyes soft and patient. As the sun climbed, the chill eased, and the shadows grew shorter. Harlan circled back to the girls, nosing gently at Grace's knee, then sitting squarely between them, a silent guardian. Lily leaned her head against his shoulder, and Grace, feeling brave, wrapped her arms around both her sister and the dog. For a moment, everything felt whole. No missing father, no bills on the fridge, no empty place at the table. Just the three of them, and the lake, and the blue sky promising, at least for a little while, that all was well. Back at the house, Ellen rinsed the mugs and hung the dish towel to dry. Her hands were rough, cracked from years of work, but gentle as she wiped crumbs from the counter. She glanced at the clock, counting the hours until the girls would return. She knew they would, because they always did. And because, even in a world that took more than it gave, there were still things you could trust: the coming of the cold, the steadiness of old dogs, and the quiet bravery of children learning to find their way. So the girls walked on, Harlan at their side, pockets full of hope and hands warmed by each other. In their smallness, they carried a strength that came not from loudness or defiance, but from enduring, from noticing, from holding tight to what little they had. The woods beckoned, golden and bright, and together they stepped forward, unafraid, into the silent heart of autumn. The woods behind Cedar Falls weren't deep or wild enough to lose yourself in, but they could seem endless to children. Here the trees grew close together, their branches woven so tightly overhead that even at midday the light fell in pale, dappled sheets. Every autumn, the air turned sweet and sharp with the scent of decaying leaves, the ground soft beneath a thick blanket of gold and brown. Grace and Lily knew these trails by heart, where the creek bent, where the owl sometimes slept, the hollow in the old maple where Grace liked to hide her treasures. On this morning, the girls followed the path that skirted the lake, Harlan leading just ahead. Occasionally, he would stop and glance back, as if to check that the girls were close, his ears pricked, nostrils testing the wind for stories only a dog could smell. To anyone watching, it was a picture of peace. Two sisters, one dog, sunlight on their hair, boots brushing through drifts of leaves. But even in the safe places, the world sometimes shifts. A sharp sound broke the hush, a ragged, broken gasp, almost swallowed by the rustle of leaves. Grace froze. She'd grown up listening for sounds, the low whistle of the kettle at home, the hush in her grandmother's voice when bills were due, the too loud clatter of plates on nights when Mom was late. She knew the difference between a bird's call, a deer's snort, and something else. This wasn't a sound that belonged to any of those. Harlan stopped, his whole body alert, head lifted. He didn't bark or bolt. He simply pressed himself a little closer to Grace, eyes fixed on a stand of birches where the ground sloped down out of sight. Lily whispered Grace's name, barely a question. Grace squeezed her sister's hand, her own breath turning shallow and quick. In moments like these, it was easier to pretend she wasn't afraid. She drew herself up, shoulders back the way she'd seen her grandmother do when faced with things she couldn't fix. Harlan waited only a moment more before moving off the path, his steps cautious, deliberate. He disappeared into the undergrowth, the tip of his tail barely visible above the ferns. The girls didn't hesitate. Fear was a cold hand at the nape of Grace's neck, but she pulled Lily behind her, the two of them pushing through brambles that clung to their coats. They saw the blood first, a narrow ribbon of dark red seeping into the earth, stark against the moss and fallen leaves. It wasn't a smear or a spray, but a line, a message left by pain and gravity. Grace's knees wobbled, but she kept moving, following Harlan's silent urgency. There, beneath the sprawling roots of an old maple, was a man. He lay curled on his side, half concealed by brush, one hand gripping his side. His uniform jacket soaked dark at the waist. His face was colorless, lips tinged blue, eyes open but glazed, staring somewhere beyond the sky. Harlan was already at his side, nudging gently at the man's arm, then settling down beside him, as if to say, "You are not alone." The girls halted, unsure, hearts hammering. Grace wanted to call for help, for her grandmother, for anyone, but her voice had left her. She dropped to her knees beside Harlan, reaching for the man's hand. His skin was cold, but he was alive, a weak pulse in his wrist, a tremor in his breath. Lily fumbled in her coat pocket for the old cell phone, her fingers clumsy with fear. The screen flickered, the battery low, the signal icon flashing a single desperate bar. She dialed 911 anyway, voice shaking as she whispered their location, or as much as she could recall. "By the lake near the old maple. There's so much blood." Static crackled, but she heard the operator's voice, distant and calm. Lily clung to that calm like a lifeline. Grace did what she could. She remembered once seeing her mother press a towel against her own cut finger, saying, "Hold it tight. The bleeding will slow." So Grace pressed her scarf, already stained with berry juice, to the wound, putting all her weight behind her small hands. The man winced, a faint sound, and Grace found herself blinking back tears. She had always wanted to be brave, to be the strong one, but now her hands were shaking, and the smell of blood was sharp, metallic, impossible to ignore. Lily finished her call, voice barely above a whisper, and knelt beside her sister. Together they worked in silence, Grace pressing the wound, Lily murmuring to Harlan, as if the old dog's steady breathing could keep them all anchored. Harlan, for his part, rested his head on the man's chest, warm and heavy, eyes always on the girls. The forest around them was silent, holding its breath. The wind moved the branches above, sending down a drift of leaves, soft as prayers. Grace felt her resolve beginning to crack, tears welling up in the corners of her eyes. For so long, she'd pretended to be unbreakable, the dependable one, her grandmother's helper, her sister's protector. Now, with blood slick on her hands, she realized she was just a child. The man's breath rasped in his chest. Harlan whined, low and urgent. Grace swallowed hard, forcing herself not to cry, not yet. "Stay with us," she thought, not daring to say it aloud. Lily gripped her hand, their fingers sticky and cold. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed, faint but growing. Grace listened to it, holding her breath, willing it to come faster. She looked at the man's face, Frank, she would later learn, and saw not a stranger, but someone as lost and tired as she sometimes felt. Someone who needed help, who needed saving, and who, by some strange turn, had found them. And so the three of them, 2 girls and a dog, waited, anchored to the world by small acts of courage, a scarf pressed to a wound, a phone call through the static, the warmth of an old dog standing guard. For the first time, Grace allowed herself to feel the fear, the helplessness, and let it shake her. But she didn't let go. The morning light shifted, golden through the branches. Somewhere above, a crow called. Harlan blinked, pressing closer to the man, and Grace let her tears fall, silent and hot, washed away by the knowledge that sometimes being strong meant being willing to break. Time seemed to slow to a crawl in that shadowed hollow beneath the maple. Grace and Lily, huddled close together, barely registered the cold anymore. Their breaths formed trembling clouds in the autumn air, dissipating as quickly as hope seemed to. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ribs, made your heart beat so loudly you feared it might echo through the trees. The only real sound was the ragged breath of the man on the ground. Frank Halbrook was somewhere between sleep and pain, drifting in and out, each inhalation a small struggle. Blood seeped between Grace's fingers, dark and sticky, staining her scarf and the cuffs of her coat. She pressed harder, knuckles whitening. She could feel her sister's hand on her shoulder, grounding her, a wordless anchor. Harlan remained utterly still, the old dog curled up beside Frank, his chin resting just above the man's hand, as if he alone could hold this piece of the world together by sheer will. His tail did not wag, his ears did not flick. Only the rise and fall of his ribs betrayed that he too was waiting, refusing to let go. The girls did what children do best. They improvised. Grace's scarf bound tight to staunch the bleeding. Lily's notebook, pages torn out and folded thick, pressed gently to keep Frank's face from the cold ground. They checked his breathing the way they remembered from a safety talk at school, not trusting their memories, but desperate to do something, anything. Grace fumbled for the phone again, checked for bars, still just the ghost of a signal. She left a brief, halting message for 911, voice cracking. Man hurt. Near Old Maple, by the big rock. We're waiting. A gust of wind rattled the leaves above, sending a flurry down around them. Some clung to Frank's uniform, others stuck in Grace's hair. The world grew smaller, more intimate, as if the trees had drawn close to shield them. Lily shivered, pulling her knees tight to her chest, but didn't complain. She watched her sister's face, watched the strain and fear giving way to something softer, more vulnerable. For a moment, Grace looked her age, or maybe younger, her mouth trembling, her eyes too bright. Frank stirred, a faint moan, then stillness. Grace nearly sobbed, but Harlan leaned into her side, his weight and warmth more comforting than any words. She steadied herself, blinking away tears, focusing on the small things she could control, the pressure of her hand, the way she kept Lily close, the softness of Harlan's fur beneath her palm. There was power in the smallest gestures. Lily, seeing her sister falter, took out her notebook again. With shaking hands, she wrote, October 14th, near the Old Maple. Man hurt, Grace helping, Harlan watching. I'm scared, but we're staying. Please, someone find us. She folded the page, tucked it into her pocket. Just in case. It was the act of recording, of naming their fear that helped. It made it real, but also manageable. She glanced at Grace, offering the smallest of smiles. No one spoke. There was no comfort in words, not now. Instead, comfort was in the rhythm of breath, the press of fingers, the gentle shiver of leaves. The girls waited, cold seeping through their clothes, hope flickering in the distance with every faint wail of a siren. Minutes dragged by. It could have been an hour or a lifetime. Grace's hands began to cramp, but she didn't let up. She remembered her grandmother's mantra, sometimes all you can do is stay. So she stayed, and Lily stayed, and Harlan stayed, and the world didn't fall apart. Frank, lost somewhere between memory and pain, felt the world narrowing to small sensations, the cold ground, the burn of his wound, the warmth pressed against him, a dog's fur, a child's hand. In the darkness behind his eyes, he saw flashes, a sunlit kitchen, the weight of a wedding ring, the sound of a daughter's laughter long ago. He heard a voice, gentle and real, "Hold on, Frank." He didn't know whose voice it was, but it called him back from the edge. Suddenly, the distant drone of a siren grew louder. It was a thin thread, but it drew all of them together. Man, dog, children, in shared relief and exhaustion. The world outside their little circle came alive. The crash of underbrush, the urgency of adult voices, the sharp beams of flashlights cutting through the trees. But even as paramedics rushed in, everything felt slow, muted. Grace let go finally, and the scarf fell away, her hands shaking, sticky with blood and mud. She watched, numb, as strangers took over. Voices clipped and professional, hands practiced, a stretcher set down on the moss. Harlan refused to move at first, refusing to let go of Frank's hand until a medic knelt and spoke softly, gently guiding him aside. The old dog stood, uncertain, then pressed his muzzle to Grace's cheek, as if thanking her for her courage, for her stillness, for not giving up. As Frank was lifted onto the stretcher, Lily slipped her folded note into the pocket of his uniform jacket, hoping someone would find it. The paramedics bundled him in blankets, attached IV lines, checked his pulse. For a moment, Grace thought Frank looked at her, his eyes flickering with a gratitude too deep for words. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the hollow was empty again, except for two girls, an old dog, and the slow return of birdsong. Grace sat in the leaves, spent, feeling the weight of everything she'd held back, everything she'd tried to be for everyone else finally break inside her. Tears came, hot and silent, but she didn't turn away. Lily put an arm around her. Harlan pressed close, and together, they let the quiet heal what the world could not. Above, the trees stood watch, the light growing softer as the afternoon drifted on. In the hush that followed, Grace realized she wasn't alone in her breaking, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay and feel it all. The woods emptied in the wake of the ambulance's red glow. The silence afterward felt heavier, as if every branch, every rock, every falling leaf had witnessed something sacred and was reluctant to speak. Harlan stayed behind for a long while, circling the spot where Frank had lain, sniffing the torn earth, the moss pressed flat beneath desperate knees. He moved slowly now, older than his years in the hush of late afternoon, waiting for the girls to finish wiping their hands on the grass, gathering their things, folding the scarf, stained now with more than just berry juice, into a tight bundle. When at last they began the walk home, their footsteps were slower, bodies drawn together by the weight of what had happened. The world seemed changed, the air sharper, the shadows longer, the meaning of everything quietly shifted by the ordeal. Lily reached for Grace's hand, and Harlan walked between them, a steady presence, his fur bristling with dried leaves and the faint scent of blood. They didn't speak, but sometimes Lily would look at her sister, and Grace would offer the barest nod, a silent promise that nothing needed saying. Back at the Jensen house, Ellen noticed them approaching before she heard the sound of boots on the porch. She had spent the afternoon tidying the kitchen, her mind wandering in anxious loops. When the girls returned, she didn't rush to them, didn't ask frantic questions. She simply opened her arms and let them fall into her embrace, holding them with a strength that had little to do with muscle and everything to do with endurance. Harlan pressed his nose against Ellen's hip and received a gentle scratch behind the ear, the old dog's way of saying, "We made it." The girls sat at the table, their faces pale, their hands restless. Ellen brewed tea, sliced bread, spooned out honey, moving with the calm of someone who had survived her own share of storms. She didn't ask about the stains on Grace's scarf or the tremor in Lily's voice. Instead, she ladled warmth into their cups and let the silence fill the space between them. Night came early. The wind rattled the windows, and the world outside seemed to fold in on itself. Upstairs, in the room the girls shared, Grace lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She replayed the scene over and over. The blood, the cold, the sound of Frank's breath, the moment she thought she might lose him. She pressed her hands together, remembering the pulse she had found, thin, fading, but there, and the way Harlan had pressed close, as if to share his own steady heartbeat. Dreams came in flickers, running through the woods, voices calling, a flashlight's beam dancing across tree trunks. She saw her mother's face, soft with worry, and felt again the rough warmth of her grandmother's hands. She didn't cry. She held herself perfectly still, as if any movement might shatter the fragile safety of the night. Meanwhile, in a small, bright hospital room across town, Frank Holbrook drifted in a borderland between sleep and memory. He was aware dimly of the pain in his side, the prickle of IV lines in his arm, the antiseptic scent of clean sheets. But he was also aware of other things less immediate, but no less real. He remembered the warmth of a child's hand pressed to his, the sound of quiet sobbing muffled in autumn leaves, the feel of a dog's fur beneath his numb fingers. He saw flashes of his wife's face in the haze behind his eyelids, her smile at the kitchen table, the way she would stand by the window in the early mornings, mug in hand, eyes soft with something like hope. There was no voice, no lecture about being careful, no admonishment for working too much, only the memory of being loved, of being needed, in small, persistent ways. Frank woke once to the hush of night nurses moving through the hallway, the beep of monitors, the press of moonlight across the floor. For a long time he watched the light climb the wall, his thoughts slow and heavy. In that half-sleep he remembered his daughter as a toddler, her hands sticky with jam, her giggles echoing through their old house. He felt an ache for what he had lost, but also something gentler, a gratitude that surprised him. As dawn came, a knock at the hospital door broke the hush. A nurse entered, trailed by a small, sturdy figure with a heavy coat and gray hair. It was Ellen, holding a paper bag filled with bread and a thermos of tea. She placed them on the bedside table, her movements careful, and sat down in the chair by the window. She didn't say much, just that the girls were safe, that Harlan was resting, that the woods had been quiet all night. Frank listened, eyes closed, letting her words settle over him like a blanket. She poured him a cup of tea, set it within easy reach, and pressed his hand between hers, rough and warm. When Ellen left, Frank found the note Lily had slipped into his pocket, a few lines in crooked, earnest handwriting. We stayed. We were scared, but we stayed. You weren't alone. He read it twice, then set it on the table beside his bed. He let the words sink in, let himself feel the fear he'd buried, let the tears well and spill quietly onto the sheets. Later, as the sun warmed the hospital room, a soft knock sounded at the door. It was a nurse, leading Harlan down the hall, special permission granted for a brief visit. The old dog padded to Frank's bedside, nose twitching, eyes shining with tired recognition. Frank reached out, resting his hand on Harlan's head, feeling the steady, forgiving pulse of a companion who asked nothing and gave everything. Frank closed his eyes, breath shaky but true, and let himself be held by memory, by small kindnesses, by the certainty that sometimes life returns not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, persistent presence of those who refuse to leave. Outside Frank's hospital window, the last of the birch leaves fluttered in the wind, shining gold against a sky so pale it seemed nearly white. The world was cooling into November, and Cedar Falls slipped quietly toward the hush of winter. In the mornings, frost traced delicate patterns on the glass, each edge catching the light just so. Inside, the small room was plain, a single bed, a chair in the corner, the smell of antiseptic and tea. The kind of place where time thickened, and every sound, every small movement, felt significant. Frank lay still, cocooned in white sheets, feeling the slow ache of healing in his body, and the duller, more insistent ache that throbbed somewhere deeper. He could hear nurses passing in the hall, the distant hum of voices at the front desk. For once, he had nothing to do, no shift to prepare for, no one waiting on him to fix, to answer, to endure. The stillness was both a balm and a test, a quiet that gave him too much room to remember. He remembered pain, yes, the flash of red, the sudden cold. But more than that, he remembered the quiet touch of small hands, the way someone, a child, had pressed her scarf tight to his side and whispered, "Hold on." He remembered a dog's steady breathing, fur warm against his cheek. He remembered, even through the pain, the feeling of not being alone. The door creaked open, and for a moment Frank's heart lifted. It was only the nurse, moving with practiced quiet. She checked his IV, straightened the covers, made a small note on her chart. He thanked her, voice rough with sleep. She smiled, not asking for more. That afternoon, Ellen arrived with Grace and Lily. They came in quietly, bringing with them the sharp air of the street, the faint smell of wood smoke and wool. Ellen set a bag on the side table, some bread, a jar of apple preserves, a hand-knitted scarf. She placed her hand gently on Frank's arm, a gesture both strong and cautious, as if testing the line between comfort and intrusion. The girls hung back, shy at first. Grace looked at the floor, her hands twisting the edge of her coat. Lily nudged her forward, and together they approached the bed, side by side, each clinging to the other as if they could borrow strength by proximity. Frank didn't say much, didn't know how, really. He looked at them with a softness that surprised even himself, saw in their faces both the memory of fear and the shimmer of relief. Lily offered him a small folded paper crane, her fingers trembling. "For luck," she said, her voice no louder than a breath. He took it, turning the delicate shape over in his palm. "Thank you," he managed, letting the gratitude sit in the space between them. He wanted to say more, to reassure them that everything would be fine now, that their bravery had made all the difference. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he reached for their hands, one small, one smaller, and squeezed gently. At the doorway, Harlan waited. The hospital staff had made an exception after some persuasion from Ellen, who was skilled at making her point without raising her voice. The old dog's tail thudded softly against the doorframe, his eyes fixed on Frank. After a moment, the nurse nodded, and Harlan patted in, slow and careful, the tap of his nails a familiar music on the linoleum. Frank let his hand drop to Harlan's head, feeling the rough, comforting warmth beneath his palm. The dog pressed closer, his sigh a vibration through Frank's bones. The room was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. It was the quiet of safety, of things returning to their places, even if imperfectly. Ellen sat in the corner, pouring tea from a battered thermos, setting out slices of bread and the jam. There was a rhythm to the small tasks, pouring, slicing, passing the cup. Grace took her mug with both hands, fingers wrapped tight around the warmth. Lily spread jam on her bread, her motions slow, deliberate. They ate in near silence, broken only by the occasional clink of spoon against cup or the gentle, distracted chatter of nurses passing by in the hall. As dusk crept up the window, the room grew dim and golden, the sort of light that blurs edges and softens everything. Frank felt it settle over him, not as a promise, but as a simple mercy, an hour without pain, without memory's teeth at his heels. Before leaving, Ellen gathered the cups, straightened the blanket at Frank's feet, brushed a crumb from Lily's chin. She bent to whisper something into Grace's ear, then pressed her lips to the girl's hair. The girls hugged Frank, brief and awkward, but real, and then were gone, their footsteps receding down the hall, leaving behind a warmth that lingered. Frank was left with the dog in the darkening room. Harlan curled at the foot of the bed, head on his paws, eyes watchful but content. Frank reached down, trailing his fingers along the dog's flank, feeling the old rhythm of trust, of presence, of forgiveness. He lay back, letting his eyes drift closed, not to sleep, but to rest. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel small, to feel tended, to let someone else be strong for a while. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the last leaves from the birch. Inside, a man and a dog found comfort in silence, in closeness, in the slow healing that comes when the world stops asking you to be brave for everyone else. November brought a hush to Cedar Falls, the world folding in on itself with each passing day. The days were shorter now, darkness settling gently over the lake and the small cluster of houses at its edge. Each morning, a pale ribbon of sunlight crept across frosted lawns, making the porch railings glitter, turning the window panes of the Jensen house into golden mirrors for a brief, stolen hour. Life resumed in slow, hesitant steps. Frank was released from the hospital with instructions written in tidy black ink. Rest, hydrate, return for follow-ups. He carried the folded page in his pocket, but rarely looked at it. He moved slowly, his sides sore but healing. There was a new sensitivity to his walk, as if each breath was borrowed. Each day another page turned in a book he'd once stopped reading. He did not return to his own empty house. Instead, Ellen invited him to stay, just until you feel steady, her voice matter-of-fact, leaving no room for argument or shame. So Frank took up residence in the back room, the one that smelled of cedar and lavender, where a patchwork quilt covered the narrow bed, and the closet held boxes of old school projects and winter coats too small for anyone now. He was not used to being tended, nor to being needed in the gentle, ordinary way of a household. The scrape of chairs on linoleum, the sound of the tea kettle, the soft shuffle of feet in slippers. Harlan, for his part, seemed to understand this was home now, or something close to it. The old shepherd moved between rooms as if cataloging his responsibilities, checking on Frank in the morning, making rounds through the kitchen, resting his chin on Grace's knee as she wrote in her notebook at the table, letting Lily curl beside him on the threadbare rug. His limp was more pronounced in the cold, but he bore it with quiet dignity, rising when the girls needed company, settling when Ellen set out his dish. Ellen herself had found new work, baking bread and scones for the local clinic. Her hands worked dough with the certainty of long habit, turning simple ingredients into sustenance, comfort, memory. She brought home loaves still warm, the scent filling the house, a balm against the sharpness of the season. On days when her joints ached, she moved slower but never complained. She taught Grace and Lily how to shape dough, how to measure by touch, how to judge when a loaf was done by its hollow ring. There were small changes, almost invisible unless you looked closely. The pile of unopened bills on the counter grew thinner as Ellen's orders increased. Grace and Lily started a new notebook. The Harlan Stories, a record of small miracles, ordinary wonders. They filled its pages with sketches of Harlan stretched in the sun, with tales of his patience, his quiet heroism, his loyalty. They wrote about that day in the woods in words spare and careful, capturing not the drama, but the waiting, the fear, the moment Harlan's steady gaze had told them to hold on just a little longer. Frank tried to help where he could. He chopped kindling in the yard, slower than before, each swing a reminder of the body's limits. He raked leaves, carried groceries, fixed the latch on the porch door. These were small offerings, but he felt them in his hands, his back, the muscles learning their way back into ordinary work. In the evenings, he sat with the family in the kitchen, sometimes reading the newspaper aloud, sometimes simply listening to Ellen hum as she knitted, to the girls laugh as they folded napkins into animals. There were setbacks, too. Nights when pain woke Frank from dreams, when the shadows in the corners of the room felt too thick. Sometimes he lingered in the doorway, unsure if he was more guest or burden. Other times he stood at the back window, watching frost form on the pane, letting the silence press in until Harlan appeared beside him, tail thumping, gaze unwavering. In those moments, Frank would kneel, lay a hand on the old dog's shoulder, and breathe, letting himself be kept company without question or demand. Grace, once withdrawn, began to come out of herself. She joined Ellen at the clinic on Saturdays, folding boxes, filling sugar bowls, learning to greet neighbors by name. Lily took to reading stories aloud, her voice shy at first, then growing stronger, filling the small house with tales of heroes and journeys and homecomings. They invited Frank to join them, never as an outsider, always as someone expected to stay. One cold morning, as the first snow began to dust the ground, Frank sat on the steps with Harlan, both of them watching the girls build a crooked snowman in the yard. Lily waved, cheeks flushed with cold, and Grace called, "Come help, Mr. Frank." For the first time in months, maybe years, he let himself laugh, the sound rising into the bright, cold air, startling and sweet. Afterward, as the sun slipped behind the hills, Ellen brought out a tray of warm bread and honey. They ate together in the kitchen, shoulders brushing, feet tangled beneath the table. Harlan stretched long and content at their feet. Grace recorded the moment in her notebook, the page neat and careful. Today we were all together. Harlan kept watch. It felt like we belonged. Frank went to bed that night with the sound of laughter in his ears, the weight in his chest a little lighter. He knew there were wounds that would not close easily, memories, regrets, aches both spoken and not. But in the slow pulse of this new life, in the routines and quiet kindnesses, he began to believe in the possibility of being healed not all at once, but in the ordinary, day after day return to living. And as he drifted to sleep, Harlan curled close by his bed, breathing deep and steady, reminding Frank that sometimes the best company is the kind that asks for nothing more than your presence. The first real snowstorm of the season arrived without much warning. It began as a gentle flurry in the early afternoon, a dusting on the windowsills, a shimmer across the fields, and by evening had thickened into a silent white curtain, the kind that muffles footsteps, erases the sharp lines of fences and rooftops, and folds the town into a world of its own. By nightfall, Cedar Falls was hushed and isolated, the only light the flicker of lanterns through curtained windows and the blue shimmer of the storm sky. Inside the Jensen house, the walls creaked as the wind pressed against them. The heat sputtered and then gave out completely, plunging the rooms into a brittle cold. Ellen, practical as ever, rummaged through the linen closet for extra blankets and handed out wool socks and scarves. The girls changed into their thickest sweaters, piling on layers, while Harlan curled close to the wood stove, his nose tucked under his tail. The electricity flickered once, twice, then failed altogether, leaving them with the amber glow of a single oil lamp and the faint, uncertain warmth of the fire. Ellen's face in the lamplight was drawn and tired, her eyes shadowed by worry but not fear. She moved through the house checking windows, stuffing towels beneath the doors, her presence a steadying weight. Frank moved more slowly. The ache in his side had returned, sharper in the cold. He stoked the fire, splitting kindling with careful, deliberate motions. Each strike was a small defiance against the wind's howl, a reassurance that he was still strong enough, still able to help. He ladled water from the kettle into a mug and carried it to Grace, who sat curled on the couch with a blanket drawn tight around her shoulders. Grace's cheeks were flushed, her forehead too warm when Ellen pressed a hand to it. "Just a touch of fever," Ellen murmured, wrapping her granddaughter in another layer. Lily fetched a bowl and helped Ellen mix up a simple oatmeal, stirring honey and cinnamon through the steam. Grace tried to smile, but she shivered, and when Frank brushed a strand of hair from her face, he felt how fragile she was in that moment, how small. There was a rhythm to their movements, Ellen checking on Grace, Lily tending to the woodbox, Frank building the fire higher, Harlan padding between them all, resting his head in each lap in turn as if counting his family, one by one. No one spoke of fear. No one said the word worry. Instead, there were small actions, a hand steadying a mug, the soft tucking of a blanket, a glance exchanged across the room when Grace's cough deepened. Outside, the snow fell in sheets, the trees groaned under its weight, branches bending, the world erased beyond the window. Harlan whined once, moving to the window to watch, as if remembering winters past, the comfort of a familiar landscape, even when transformed. Later, Ellen dozed in her armchair, Lily curled at her feet with a book forgotten in her lap. Frank sat close to the hearth, Grace's feverish head resting in his lap. The old dog sprawled beside them, body pressed to the cold floorboards, radiating a warmth more faithful than any fire. It was in these hours stretched long by darkness and the sense of being cut off from the rest of the world, that Frank felt the full weight of being needed, of being present. He watched the girls sleep, Ellen's steady breathing, Harlan's twitching paws, and something in him softened. For years he had been the strong one, the reliable one, always bracing himself for the next blow, the next loss. But now, in this small circle of light, he let himself care in ways that hurt and healed at the same time. When Grace's fever spiked, Frank was the one to dampen a washcloth, holding it gently to her brow. Lily woke, frightened by the sound of her sister's labored breathing, but Frank whispered, quiet and steady, that it would pass, that he was there. Ellen made a thin broth on the fire, feeding it to Grace in spoonfuls, patience in every gesture. Harlan watched, always close, always watchful, as if lending his own calm to the troubled room. The night passed in fragments, dozing, waking, checking the fire, listening to the wind. Sometimes Frank found himself standing by the window, looking out into the white blur, searching for the certainty that they would all make it through. He saw his own reflection in the glass, gaunt, older than he remembered, eyes shadowed. He pressed his palm against the cold pane, grounding himself in the quiet chaos of the house behind him. It was only as the first light began to leak across the sky, as the storm's rage gave way to the heavy hush of morning, that Grace's breathing eased, her fever breaking. Frank let out a long, shuddering sigh, tears prickling his eyes. Relief, exhaustion, the knowledge that for one more night, he had managed to hold everyone together. Ellen brewed strong tea. Lily, pale but smiling, brought out the last of the preserves, spreading jam on toast with slow care. Harlan, worn out by his vigil, rested his head on Frank's foot, tail thumping weakly as if to say, "We did it. We're still here." There was no fanfare, no loud proclamation of triumph, just the soft clink of cups, the low voices, the gentle movements of a family bound together by having weathered another storm, not unscathed, but together. In the smallness of their survival, Frank saw something new. Not just the cost of caring, but the grace in allowing himself to need and to be needed, to break and to mend again and again beneath the quiet watch of the old dog who never once looked away. When the storm finally let go of Cedar Falls, the world outside the Jensen house was almost unrecognizable. Drifts climbed the porch steps and pressed thick against the door, sculpted into soft curves by the night wind. Icicles hung from the eaves like glass bells, catching the weak sun as it began to break through the leaden sky. The silence after the storm was thick and clean, as if the world itself had taken a slow, careful breath. Inside, the first real warmth in days came from the stove. Ellen was up before anyone else, wrapped in her old robe, hands curled around a chipped mug of tea as she watched the kettle rattle on the flame. She moved through the kitchen quietly, setting out the last of the bread, counting the eggs in the blue ceramic bowl. Her movements were careful, patient. She knew the girls would sleep late after the night they'd all survived. Grace woke first, blinking at the frost painted on the inside of the window pane, her breath rising in small clouds. The fever was gone, leaving behind only a deep weariness. But as she sat up, she realized her head was clear. Sunlight crept across the floor, lighting up the dust motes that spun lazily in the air. She listened. The gentle hum of Ellen in the kitchen, the small click of Lily turning the page of a book, the faint snore of Harlan sprawled in the doorway, belly up, legs twitching in a dream. She slid out of bed, wrapping a sweater around her shoulders, and went in search of the others. Lily was curled in the big chair by the window, feet tucked beneath her. A novel splayed open across her knees. Her cheeks were pale, but her eyes brightened when she saw Grace. Without a word, she set the book aside and made room for her sister beside her. They sat together, pressed close, the kind of silence between them that had nothing to do with fear or sadness, just a quiet knowing. Frank stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching in the snow. The cold was sharp, but the sky above the lake was the blue of old denim, the sort of color that promised spring might come after all. He took a long breath, letting it fill his chest, feeling something loosen inside. A knot he'd been holding so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. At his side, Harlan limped into the yard, nose raised, tail swinging in a slow, contented arc. They walked together to the edge of the lake, the world muffled and shining. Frank watched the girls through the window, saw them lean into one another, saw Lily laugh at something Grace whispered. He felt the urge to say something, to call out, to claim this simple happiness. Instead, he only watched. When Harlan nosed his hand, Frank knelt, resting his forehead against the old dog's neck. "Thank you," he murmured. The words not quite a prayer, but something close. Harlan's ears flicked, and for a long moment they simply stood together. The dog and the man, two survivors who had learned the hard way how to stay. Later, back inside, Ellen poured hot tea for everyone. The girls crowded around the table, bare feet on the worn linoleum, laughter rising as the jam was passed and crumbs scattered. The kitchen was filled with a gentle, golden light. Frank carried in firewood, the ache in his side less sharp now, his steps steadier. Harlan followed, settling with a sigh at the girl's feet. There was no hurry, no urgent list of things to do. Ellen took her time with breakfast. Lily helped with the dishes. Grace swept crumbs into her hand for Harlan, who accepted each morsel with quiet patience. The ordinary rhythms of the house had returned, slower perhaps, and softer, but more precious for it. They lingered over second cups, talking in low voices, not about the storm or the fears of the night, but about small things, the shape of the snowdrifts, the taste of wild honey, the story in Lily's book. Frank looked around the table, at Ellen, her hair a silver halo in the sunlight, at Grace, tracing the rim of her mug with her finger, at Lily, humming under her breath, at Harlan, snoring gently in the warmth. He realized that for the first time since his own family slipped away from him, he felt himself truly present, anchored not by duty or necessity, but by choice. He belonged here in this small kitchen, with these people and this dog. After breakfast, the girls bundled into coats and boots, and Frank took Harlan out for a walk along the lake. The snow crunched underfoot. The air was bright and sharp. Harlan moved slowly, his limp more pronounced in the cold, but his head was high, his gaze attentive. The girls followed behind, stopping to gather bits of bark and pine cones, to marvel at the glittering ice along the shoreline. Frank stopped to look at the view, a stretch of white, broken only by the shadows of trees and the faint tracks of deer. He let himself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in years. Harlan pressed against his leg, and Frank scratched behind his ears, fingers lingering in the thick fur. He looked at the girls, at the house smoke curling from the chimney, and understood that here, in this moment, he was exactly where he was meant to be. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Frank found a piece of scrap wood and an old carving knife. He shaped the wood slowly, sanding its edges smooth, working in silence by the kitchen window while Harlan lay beneath the table. When he was done, he painted 3 small words on it. Home is here. He set the sign by the front step as the girls watched, Ellen's hand resting lightly on his shoulder. As night fell, the house was filled with the soft sounds of life. Ellen's knitting needles clicking, Lily turning pages, Grace writing in her notebook, Harlan's breath steady and deep. Frank sat at the table, a mug of tea cooling in his hands, the fire casting gold across the walls. There was no need for words, no need to explain. In the hush after the storm, in the ordinary grace of being together, they had found their way home. The last light of the day spilled across the porch, spilling amber on the frozen grass and painting the kitchen windows in a soft, honey glow. It was the kind of evening that made everything slower, the shadows growing long across the lake, the wind brushing softly through the birch trees, the world pausing for a breath, as if not to disturb what had finally settled inside the small wooden house. Grace, Lily, and Harlan sat on the back steps, knees drawn up beneath old sweaters, their cheeks still flushed from the afternoon walk. Harlan's head rested on Grace's knee, his eyes half closed, content just to feel the girl's hands in his fur and the press of their shoulders. The silence between them was whole, no longer heavy or tense, but the kind that feels earned, the hush that arrives only after something has been weathered together. Inside, Frank stood by the kitchen window, watching the scene outside with a kind of awe. He turned the little notebook the girls kept in his hands, the cover worn soft by months of use, the pages inside blooming with sketches and stories and secret hopes. He found a blank page, uncapped his pen, and in his careful, blocky print wrote, "No one is perfect, just kind enough to stay." He closed the notebook gently, letting his fingers linger on the paper as if the words themselves were a promise. For so long he had tried to be the unshakable one, the person everyone else leaned on, afraid to show the small, raw wounds beneath his steadiness. Now, as the night drifted in, he realized that the deepest strength was in letting himself be known, tender, imperfect, tired, still willing to show up, to love. Ellen moved quietly around the kitchen, humming an old lullaby as she washed the last of the mugs. She paused by the door, looking out at the three on the porch. Her gaze lingered on Frank. The gentle way he reached for Harlan, the care with which he tucked a blanket around Lily's shoulders. She smiled, lines creasing deeper around her eyes, her hands still warm from kneading bread. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that families are not made from blood alone, but from the slow accumulation of shared troubles, small mercies, silent comforts. Later, as twilight slipped into true night, the family gathered by the fire. No one spoke much. Lily leaned her head against Ellen's side. Grace curled up with Harlan on the rag rug, her fingers idly tracing the patterns in his fur. Frank sat cross-legged, his gaze soft, the sign he'd carved. "Home is here," propped up on the mantel, catching the light. The silence held the house like a gentle hand, the crackle of the fire the only music needed. Harlan let out a soft, contented sigh, closing his eyes. The old dog had traveled a long road to find this hearth, a stray, an outcast, a survivor with a limp who'd become, by his quiet constancy, the heart that kept them all together. There was no need for heroics, no grand display. His gift was presence, to bear witness, to hold the line, to refuse to leave. In the hush, Frank reached out and let Harlan rest his head on his knee. The warmth, the weight, the trust between them, these were the things that healed what could not be spoken. As the fire burned lower, the house grew quiet. Ellen rose, folding blankets, her movements unhurried. She kissed the girls goodnight, pressed a hand to Frank's shoulder, and went to her own room, the door left slightly ajar. The girls lingered by the fire. Harlan sprawled between them, the kind of togetherness that needed nothing more. Grace looked out the window, her breath clouding the glass, and whispered into the darkness, "We're here. We're safe." Lily squeezed her hand. The words were not a question, nor a declaration, just a truth to hold on to. Frank sat a while longer in the afterglow. He let himself remember every hard thing: loss, loneliness, the fear of failing, the weight of being strong for too long. But now those memories found a resting place. They did not press so sharply in the company of warmth, of small kindnesses repeated until they felt like belonging. Outside, the world rested under a hush of stars, the snow silvered and soft. The lake lay still. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called, 3 notes, low and steady. Harlan's ears twitched, but he did not move. He knew this place, these people, the safety of enough. It was late when the last light was doused. The girls, bundled in bed, drifted into sleep, their breathing even, their dreams gentle. Harlan, slow with age, leapt up to the foot of Frank's bed, turning 3 times before settling, his muzzle pressed to Frank's ankle. Frank let his hand rest there, feeling the slow rhythm of the dog's breath, and let his own heart slow to match. And so, in the hush of winter night, the small family found their way, by the light of a stove, the shelter of old walls, the unwavering loyalty of a dog, and the quiet promise that here no one needed to pretend anymore. Sometimes the greatest healing is to stay, to sit together in the silence after the storm, to let the warmth linger, to know in a world that so often asks us to be strong, that it is enough, more than enough, to simply belong. In the end, it wasn't heroics or perfection that held this small family together. It was presence, a hand reaching out in the dark, a dog's steady loyalty, the warmth of a kitchen lit by kindness instead of certainty. We all carry our own quiet wounds. Maybe what saves us, in the end, is allowing ourselves to stay, to belong, and to be seen, even when we feel most broken. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear what moments stayed with you most, or the gentle lessons you carry from your own journey. Leave a comment below if you wish. Your words might be the comfort someone else needs today. Thank you for listening. May you always find warmth in ordinary company and healing in the simple act of staying close.